In 1960s London, women's bodies began appearing beside the freezing, murky waters of the River Thames. Beneath the bright, colorful veneer of the swinging 60s, a much darker, far more sinister reality was taking shape in the city's industrial shadows. Today, we're stepping back into that foggy, rain-soaked metropolis to examine a grim sequence of discoveries, a case that completely baffled Scotland Yard and left an entire community paralyzed by fear. Now, you know how the press is, always eager to capitalize on public panic. Well, they quickly gave this unknown killer a terrifying nickname. Deliberately invoking the memory of a monster from a century prior, they called him Jack the Stripper. This moniker was splashed across front pages everywhere, as the killer's disturbing habit of leaving his victims undressed along the riverside became apparent. And that name? It immediately established this suffocating tension across London. A predator was actively hunting in the shadows of the suburbs, and absolutely no one knew who he was. Part 1. The River's Dark Secret. Let's trace exactly how this grim sequence of events began to unfold along the freezing banks of the Thames. The escalation here was chillingly methodical. It starts in June 1959, when 21-year-old Elizabeth Figg was discovered strangled at Duke's Meadows in Chiswick. Then there's a long gap. It wasn't until late 1963 that 22-year-old Gwyneth Rees was found on a refuse dump in Mortlake. But the real turning point? That was February 1964, when 30-year-old Hannah Tailford washed ashore near Hammersmith Bridge. That's when police finally realized they weren't looking at isolated incidents. Tailford was discovered freezing and abandoned on the muddy foreshore. A serial killer was actively using the quiet, nocturnal stretches of the river as his personal dumping ground. There is a heartbreaking commonality linking these victims too. They were highly vulnerable targets. We're talking about young women, mothers. Some, like Tailford and a later victim, Irene Lockwood, were even pregnant at the time. Many were immigrants from Scotland, Wales, and Ireland who had traveled to London with big dreams, only to find themselves forced into sex work just to survive. Their desperate circumstances pushed them to the margins of Bayswater Road and Shepherd's Bush, placing them directly in the path of a remarkably cold and calculating killer. Part 2. A macabre signature. As more bodies were found, detectives realized they weren't tracking just any random attacker. They were dealing with a highly organized psychopath who had a twisted calling card. First off, he exclusively targeted petite women, mostly under 5 feet 2 inches tall. All of them were asphyxiated or manually strangled. And in a truly horrific, highly specific mutilation, several victims had their front teeth extracted post-mortem. But the absolute crucial breakthrough came with victims like Helen Barthélemy and Mary Fleming. Investigators discovered these tiny flecks of industrial paint, the kind used in car manufacturing, on their skin. This was massive. It was the first real clue suggesting the killer stored his victims in some sort of industrial workspace before moving them. By November 1964, things escalate. The killer's confidence is clearly growing. The discovery of Frances Brown, whose real name was Margaret McGowan, proved he was becoming much bolder. Brown wasn't a street worker. She was an upmarket call girl known to mix with businessmen and politicians, and had even testified in the infamous Profumo affair. She was last seen getting into a client's car, which witnesses described as a gray Ford Zephyr or Zodiac. Her body was later found in a Kensington car park. This was a really bold departure from the killer's usual dark, suburban riverside dumping grounds. Part 3. The Paint Factory Clue. This escalating boldness forced Scotland Yard to completely double down on the one physical link they had. Then, in February 1965, they got a breakthrough. The body of Bridget O'Hara was discovered near the Huron Trading Estate in Acton. Her body showed signs of partial mummification. Now, what does that tell us? It means she had been stored somewhere very warm. Nearby, police found a large electrical transformer unit located right opposite a paint spraying shop. It was literally the perfect hidden environment. The transformer provided the intense heat that mummified the body, and the location perfectly explained the environmental contamination, those matching flecks of industrial paint. They had finally found the killer's secret storage location. Part 4. Scotland Yard's desperate hunt. With the killer's hideout seemingly located, the investigation completely kicks into overdrive. 7,000. I really want you to let that number sink in. 7,000 men. Chief Superintendent John DeRose, a highly respected detective they called 5-Day Johnny, was brought in to lead a massive, almost panic police response. Because they believed the killer worked in or around that Huron trading estate, police literally interviewed virtually every single one of the 7,000 men employed there. The sheer scale and weight of this investigation was just staggering. They set up roadblocks, and this massive intelligence dragnet descended right upon industrial West London. Part 5. Faces in the Fog. Out of those thousands and thousands of interviews, a chilling list of primary suspects began to take shape. To give you an idea of how incredibly wide this net was cast, just look at two of the early prominent suspects. On one side, you have Mungo Ireland. He was a respectable Scottish security guard who worked night shifts at the exact same trading estate where the bodies were kept. On the other side, you have Freddie Mills, a former British light heavyweight boxing champion with alleged ties to serious gangland figures like the Cray twins. Rumors in the criminal underworld were constantly pointing to Mills, even though official, hard evidence was scarce. But then, the investigation into Mungo Ireland comes to a sudden, tragic halt. Believing the police were closing in on him after Duros made some pretty bold statements to the press, Ireland took his own life by carbon monoxide poisoning. He actually left a note for his wife that read, "I can't stick it any longer, and to save you and the police looking for me, I'll be in the garage." Naturally, many saw this as a clear admission of guilt. But here's the twist. Later research suggested Ireland was actually up in Scotland when one of the victims vanished. That gave him a solid alibi and temporarily completely derailed the police's momentum. Years later, though, modern criminologists pivoted the narrative to perhaps the most disturbing suspect of the entire case. A man who had already killed twice before, operating right under the noses of the Metropolitan Police. Consider the terrifying history of a man named Harold Jones. He was a convicted murderer from Wales. Back in 1921, when he was just 15 years old, he brutally murdered 2 young girls. Because of his age, he escaped the death penalty, and he was ultimately released in 1941. Fast forward to the 1960s, and he had moved to Fulham, West London. He was living under an alias terrifyingly close to exactly where the victims vanished. Plus, Jones was diminutive in stature, he was known to inflict extreme violence, and he actually worked as a metalworker at the Heron Trading Estate. But because of poor record-keeping at the time, he was never flagged by Scotland Yard during the initial manhunt. Part 6. An unsolved nightmare. Because despite all these leads, the evidence, and the massive police presence, the case takes one final, eerie turn. In 1965, the murders just stopped. The killer literally vanished into the fog as completely as he had emerged from it. So what happened? Did the intense police dragnet at the Heron estate force him to stop his spree? Did he die? Perhaps by suicide like Mungo Ireland, or from bone cancer like Harold Jones? The massive police task force was eventually reduced and quietly disbanded. They left a terrified city holding its breath, and a massive case file sitting dead cold. Ultimately, behind the forensic paint flecks and the lists of chilling suspects, we absolutely have to remember the human cost here. Elizabeth Figg, Gwyneth Reese, Hannah Tailforth, Irene Lockwood, Helen Bartholomew, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, Bridget O'Hara. These were real women. They were mothers, daughters, and friends whose lives were brutally, senselessly cut short. Their humanity must always stand in stark contrast to the cold, unsolved anonymity of their killer. Decades later, the Hammersmith Nude Murders remain this haunting, open wound in British police history. It's a twisted puzzle of missing teeth, industrial pain, and a killer who somehow slipped through the fingers of the largest manhunt of its time. Will modern profiling ever definitively unmask the monster who stalked the Thames? Or is his identity destined to remain buried forever in the dark industrial underbelly of the swinging 60s? Thank you for exploring this dark chapter with us. You've been watching London Noir.